have so many people in the room, but feel free to fill the front row seats. They're not being reserved for VIPs as well. We're delighted to have Heidi Crebo-Rediker for the first time at the Global Cybersecurity Forum and the annual meeting specifically. And we're looking at the nexus between geoeconomics and global cybersecurity. I had this kind of framework in my mind about the new normal, which is a phrase you would be familiar with because it was during the financial crisis of 2008 to 10.
Right.
Like it was very abnormal, and we had the G20 come forward with an interjection of liquidity, and then we had the COVID-19 pandemic. One could make the argument that we live, the new normal is constant today with constant chaos. And we'd love to have you draw the architecture, if you will, that nexus between geoeconomics and cybersecurity and why it's so important. Like me, you were singling out the statement from the Crown Prince, His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman, and that he singled out resilience and why it's so important. How do you see that, Heidi?
So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. And I was particularly pleased that the Crown Prince not only singled out resilience, but also economic prosperity and economic security in the context of cyber, because the two are highly linked. In terms of the framing around geopolitics and the kind of change that we're seeing, and looking increasingly at national economic security, cyber and cyber threats, particularly to critical infrastructure, are, I think, one of the greater threats that we're not paying enough attention to globally. But if you think about it, the types of things that we look at with critical infrastructure underpin the entire economy of every country. How we move goods, people, data, financial flows, and all of those, in the context of like a hard kinetic war, you see that those are the assets that are often attacked. So if you bombing bridges and taking out energy systems and various types of infrastructure. In some of the efforts to get global coordination on rules of engagement around cyber, one of the areas that was tried was to really cull back attacks on civilian infrastructure, cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure. And where we ended up is that we have a lot of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure now. It's actually pre-engagement to any kinetic war action. It's a combination of state actors, state-sponsored actors, criminal actors, but a lot of those attacks are on critical infrastructure. In terms of what has changed, what is the new normal? It's a lot of convergence of not only the geopolitical direction of travel, which we're seeing an axis of kind of malign actors in the cyberspace coalesce, and they happen to be very significant actors, and they are working increasingly together in some of the major conflict areas or potential conflict areas around the world. We also are seeing the technology change very quickly. We're also seeing critical infrastructure, which used to be sort of dumb roads and bridges, and they're increasingly connected and they're increasingly smart. So that is new. You have smart infrastructure, and that's a good thing. You want to have smart infrastructure. You want to have greater efficiency in energy. You want to have, you want to have interconnectivity. You want to have payment systems that are linked. That is all positive, but it also creates huge vulnerabilities in the cyber space. And a lot of that smartness comes from third-party suppliers and supply chain providers through supply chain. So you have a multiplication of the vulnerability.
In the opening session today, we talked about de-escalating the tensions that we see in the world today. And it's a very complex world that you and I were talking about. And I saw that there's the UN Digital Compact and the Summit for the Future, which singled out with 193 countries to have child protection and education online, which is a good thing, but that's fairly easy to agree with, right, to protect children. Why is it so complex in the multilateral world, in your view, Heidi, to reach agreement here? Because you said something very profound. It's the first point of action now as opposed to physical conflict. So do you want to explain, can we change that? Can we de-escalate, in your view, in the context of that link between geoeconomic competition and collaboration? Because even the US and China are highly codependent on each other.
So I note from the opening panel some skepticism that the UN would be able to, in this particular space outside of protection of children, which I think we can all agree is one area where we should all focus attention and make sure that children around the world are protected from digital malign actors. But I think the UN is probably not the right institution for a global platform for cybersecurity. Part of the challenge is that two of that access that I mentioned of the malign actors who are supremely good at cyber attacks are on the UN Security Council. And so when you're looking to build trust, you're looking to connectivity. I think the UN's probably not the right place, but there are a lot of mini-lateral spaces where this is very active. There are a lot of different coordinating bodies, whether G7, certain parts of the G20 over time. You have right now in Washington, you have, it's ransomware week, where you have the White House coordinating with 68 countries around the world on ransomware, and particularly how to combat cyber attacks against energy systems and healthcare systems and emergency services. And USAID is actually providing funding for some poorer countries to actually have better access to technology and training around cyber systems. But globally, we have, the targets are global. The sources are well known and need global action because they come from multiple jurisdictions. So you need to work together with trusted partners. You have the need for any kind of warning systems for companies, for any infrastructure providers, that certain risks are out there and vulnerabilities are out there, and how to coordinate on those and really provide resilience. And then the last thing is for when you can make an attribution of a cyber attack, that there are coordinating global partners and trusted partners to sanction and to actually, which is happening real time right now as we are having constant barrage of cyber attacks happen. You have a multiplicity of countries coming together to actually sanction those who are responsible.
Is it effective, you think? That's an interesting point you're raising here. It's almost like a coalition of the willing to say we can't let this go undetected and then punished.
So I think that you do need the coalition of the willing, and you do see a lot of the sanctioning coming from countries that actually have levers, whether it's through their global financial centers, their global centers that bad actors might want to transact through. And so I think it's yet to be seen how effective the sanctioning is, but you're really limited in response. If you're a state, you're limited in the response that you can actually have, other than providing as much resilience as possible to the infrastructure that you have.
Good. One of the key points, and you worked in financial markets for better than 2 decades, so you know what I'm talking about here, is that, for example, banking institutions and healthcare systems are based on trust. You expect as a patient or as a client to a bank that your assets are protected, for example. So it's kind of chicken and egg, because you want to have collaboration with competitors because you want to share the best practices, but you don't want to express your vulnerabilities if you've been hacked, right? So how do you move forward with banks, for example, just to use a case study, that are normal competitors, but they actually want to maintain that trust in the global financial system?
So it's a big challenge, but I think it's one that you have enough enough coordination in the in cyber defense that you I think particularly in financial services, there's a lot of acknowledgement that working together in the cyberspace is critical. What I would say that it's much more challenging to do, it's for smaller financial institutions, for more global financial institutions that don't have the resources to actually provide for the cyber safety. And then to go back to your earlier point, the trust factor, when you're dealing with not only the companies that are competitors in financial services, but really in any sector, bringing them together and saying, yes, you need to fess up when you have a cyber attack. You need to report it, and there's a role for national, for sort of a coordinated national sort of base of requiring those reports.
Interesting.
In the interest of protecting others.
Good. I didn't want to skip over this. How do you define critical infrastructure today? Because the first thing comes to mind is a banking system or a power grid, healthcare systems, airport systems, but you're the specialist here. How do you define critical infrastructure when it comes to cybersecurity? Would you say, Heidi?
So I come to this from the background, the infrastructure and economic security background, and so I'm not a cyber expert, but we have within the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. a division called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and just because the conference is focused on women in cyber, it's run by one of the most talented women we have in the cyber community globally, Jen Easterly. And they have 16 parts of critical infrastructure sectors that range from election security to all of the traditional types of infrastructure you might think of, whether it's water, wastewater, energy systems, transportation, but very broadly defined. And when you think of transportation, also think of the linkages that we have on like ports, and also in telecommunications, undersea cables, space, and location services and things like that. So it's a pretty wide range. But anything that would really contribute to destabilizing the function of your economy, anything that could cripple your economy, and healthcare systems do fall into their definition of critical infrastructure.
Great. I was really surprised, I don't know why, but the FBI said pretty early in the game that there's some state actors trying to influence the outcome of the elections, and they may have different opinions of which horse they want to back between President Trump and the Vice President Kamala Harris today. But it's a fairly nasty game. I think this audience should be aware of what takes place. But the fact that the U.S. FBI was willing to step up and say, we see it, we're tracking it, this is what's taking place. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Very prominent Iranian-backed attack on the Trump campaign. That's very public. It's in the press, and it was there was an amount of data that was shared with press and it was during when Biden was still running, and so it's important that it's flagged, that people know that there is election interference and who's doing it, and also notable that this is not just criminal activity; it's actually state-backed activity.
Wow. Okay. In the morning session, I think you could shed some light on this as well. We talked about the COVID-19 response, and you want the collective good for society, but then if you're an elected official or the natural inclinations to protect your society as a leader, and then we left the developing world wanting for vaccines, if you will. Can we apply that and make sure that as cybersecurity and cybercrime is surging, how do we ensure that the developing world doesn't take a leapfrog, going backwards because they don't have the assets and they don't have the collaboration. You touched on it earlier in your comments, but how do you set this as a priority globally within multilateral institutions, or just like a Saudi Arabia being very concerned about Africa as a growth market, as a partner? How would you handle that nuance?
So most of the cyber attacks that are happening right now are actually against the U.S. and EU. They happen very, very broadly, but to go after vulnerabilities that are digital and connected, where they're assets that fall into the geopolitical spectrum, that is where we're seeing most of the attacks. I think that is a good place for the UN. Also for multilateral institutions like the IMF, who flagged cybersecurity risks as being systemic, and do have the ability to weigh in and provide technical assistance for countries if they are trying to make their systems to protect their financial stability more robust than they are right now. So I think there's definitely a greater acknowledgement that we need to pay attention to not just the US and Europe, India, Japan, but that we need to look across the world and provide the support that they need.
Good. I'm not sure if you're surprised, but I've been involved with the Global Cybersecurity Forum and now the Institute for 3 years. And when I first started, the economic damage was $2.3 trillion, and the estimate to the end of 2025 is to be about $10.5 trillion. It's scale and it's moving fast, and I wanted to see if you can finish on the thought that we're embracing AI as a technology, and then companies and countries want to stay at the cutting edge of this, and then quantum, which will add a layer of complexity. So what's the message to the audience here about making sure you act and act swiftly?
So yes, act and act swiftly. I think you'll have a lot of people speaking over the next couple of days about the amplification of the risks of AI with the overlay of cyber threats. So you do have that velocity of change in technology, but you also have you have a vast number of attacks that are very low grade and not sophisticated, and I think that's sort of the low-hanging fruit, and where at least in the U.S. we're trying to, from a policy perspective, reach out to state and local governments, to small businesses, to any parts of supply chains, and especially systemically important parts of critical infrastructure, to make sure that they don't fall prey to just the human error of clicking on the wrong button and downloading malware, or using a default password, because that is, I mean, if I can give an example, we've had a lot of attacks in the U.S. on our water systems, and a lot of our water systems are run by state and local governments, and Iran actually attacked 10 different water systems that were using Israeli technology in the United States, and were highly disruptive.
It was extraordinary, though, because that was actually the intelligence services working with Homeland Security to local authorities that were able to rescue the systems, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so that's the sort of collaboration and awareness that you were referring to earlier in the discussion. Our 20 minutes went too fast, that's all I got to say.
So a lot more to talk about, but hopefully this was interesting enough for you to think about your critical infrastructure and how important it is to your economic security.
And then, the new frontier of competition at the same time. Can we give a nice round of applause to Heidi Crebo-Rediker joining us here at the Global Cybersecurity Forum. Thank you.